Humans podcast. My name's Hallie Madeline, and each week we'll be interviewing inspiring humans from all over the world who are living examples of what happens when you pour energy into yourself so that you're better equipped to give energy to the world around you. It starts within, but it doesn't end within, because when we show up for ourselves, we show up for the world. Hi everyone, we're here today with Jessica Sharp. She is an amazing human, a nonprofit professional, and the owner of Sharp Brain Consulting. She focuses on thinking about things from a brain perspective, including mindfulness, meditation, and is especially passionate about the effects of poverty and trauma on the brain. In this episode, she's going to teach us a little bit about how to rewire our reactions from past traumas through meditation and breath work, and teach us all about the brain and which aspects of our brain are in control when we're in certain states of mind. So without further ado, here's Jessica with all of her amazing wisdom and knowledge. All right, everybody, we are here today with Jess Sharp of Sharp Brain Consulting, and thank you so much for being here.
No problem. I can't wait to get going and start chatting.
Yay! Amazing. Well, first of all, how is your heart today? How are you feeling? Where is your head at?
I am feeling really good. So I am in the middle of, it's in June, so I'm in the middle of participating in Equity Challenge in Greenville, South Carolina, where I live, with some nonprofit professionals. And we had a really, really great session today, just kind of debriefing the week and chatting. And so I'm in a really just like very happy, good, kind of energized spot right now. So,
amazing.
And and from like a personal, I don't know, like fun fact perspective, I'm always, the way in which I work, I like to have things on in the background, and I normally watch television shows that I've seen 25 million times, but I've just started Veronica Mars again, and I don't really remember a lot. So I'm like having fun, like rewatching this show that I watched like when I was in high school. So that's another just random thing that I'm enjoying right now in life.
I love that. That's so fun. Yeah. I love that. So do you want to tell us a little bit, for anyone listening who hasn't connected with you yet, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do and who you are and just all of the amazing things you're up to in this life?
Yeah. So I am, gosh, I wear a lot of hats, kind of depending on the day of the week. I am a nonprofit professional, so I work in a nonprofit. I do fundraising and a little bit of working directly with teenagers. So that's my day job, which is a little slow-ish right now because of COVID. But it's, that's what I do on a day-to-day basis. But I also have a consulting company, Sharp Brain Consulting, and I work primarily with organizations who are interested in kind of leveling up, if you will, their organization, but really thinking about things from a brain perspective. And I have recently kind of scaled up the work I do in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I'm working with some organizations to support them on their journey to be a more equitable organization. And I'm working on some work that women will be able to be involved in, kind of independent of an organization. So really excited about that. I am about halfway through a doctoral program. I keep saying it might be my last degree. I just really like learning, and I'm a nerd about it. So that program focuses on psychology, leadership, and organizational development. So I am a brain expert. I've done a whole lot of research on the brain and continue to get a lot of education on the brain. And so kind of my favorite things to talk about are how poverty and trauma impacts the brain, which is a weird thing to like enjoy talking about, but it's because I feel like if we can understand that, we, like those of us who work with people who live in poverty and people who have experienced trauma, we can do better with them. And also, I really enjoy talking about this concept of unconscious bias, which are stories that we make up about groups of people before we interact with them. So those are kind of some of the things I do. I do a lot of volunteering in Greenville, where I live in South Carolina. So yeah, I'm just kind of always running around doing random things, and then taking naps and watching TV as like a form of self-care.
Yes. Well, seems like I'm so glad that you're doing that. You deserve all the rest in the world. That is That's amazing. Like all the things you're up to are so important and so impactful, and they seem like they all kind of connect together too.
They really do. Yeah.
Yeah. So have you always known that you wanted to get into this line of work? Or I guess like what's your story and your like trajectory of like diving into work on this path?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I didn't. When kind of growing up, I didn't really know like what I wanted to do. Both of my parents started off in accounting. My dad is now in finance. My mom isn't working right now. She's a stay-at-home mom with my brother who's 11. We have a big age gap. But she was in accounting too. So, for a while I thought maybe accounting was my track, and it wasn't, just because that's just not the thing that gives me energy that I want to do. So when I was in college, I was working in the summers at teen camp, at a summer camp, doing, at the where I'm working now, doing working with middle schoolers. And that was cool. And I was like, this is fun, still kind of trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I was in a business school. So I started off with accounting, figured out pretty quickly that wasn't what I wanted to do. And then I was like, what major, like I actually really wanted to switch to education, but I didn't. My parents said they would pay for 4 years of college and that was it. And I didn't want to be in college beyond 4 years and I'd pay for it. So I was like, well, what can I do that's in the business school that I think would be good and fun or whatever? So I switched to marketing. So my undergraduate degree is in marketing, but I just still didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I did Teach for America, and I taught at a Title I school, like everybody who does TFA does. And then when I got done with that, I moved here back to Greenville, where I live now. And I started doing the job I have now. It's kind of similar to the job I had then, but I continue to work with young people because, I like teaching, and I was like, this seems, good. And then I pretty quickly found myself like asking questions internally, like, I wonder why the kids in Charlotte, where I taught, who were poor, have very similar behaviors to the kids in Greenville who are living in poverty too. I was like, figure this out. So it kind of, and just in general, why do teenagers behave the way that they do was a question coming up in my mind. So then it started a journey where I wanted to learn as much as possible about the brain, because I wanted it to inform my programs, and I wanted to expand and enhance the work that I was doing. So I started learning about the brain. And then a lot of the next steps were intentional, but but as an immediate intentionality. So I thought I was going to be at the YMCA where I work now, where I worked there forever. And then I got asked to apply for a job at the large health system in town. And I was like, I don't know about that. And then I applied, and I was like, oh my gosh, I want this job now. So I worked at a hospital doing diversity and inclusion work for a few years, which like planted a seed. Then I knew I wanted to work at a more traditional nonprofit. So I left the hospital and went to Meals on Wheels. And then I left out. I kind of just had all of these, like, I would have these job changes to kind of help me get to to a next step. But throughout the entire time, I continued to ask questions about people and systems and why things are the way that they are. And for example, like, why is it so hard for people to move out of poverty? Like, what systems are in place that make it really, really hard? And like, why, does the zip code you live in impact your life? So I dig into these, like, I'd go on these like rabbit holes of basically figuring stuff out. And then it got me to this place where my goal in life and in my organization, like in Sharp Brain Consulting, is to figure out how I can provide education and support to people and organizations to therefore like improve the world. So like I work a lot with nonprofits. I work with, women who can then change their world. So yeah, I mean, I just kind of stumbled into a lot of like, well, this seems like a really good next step, that then was part of what I didn't know at the time was a larger pathway.
Yeah, that's incredible. I feel like the best stories come from that, of like not necessarily knowing, but just like being open and just like taking the next step in front of you and like seeing what comes from that. And it's also connected, like all of that. And that's so true, that it is a ripple effect, that like even just if you like impact one person's life and then they go forward and impact another person's life, like it's always such an uplifting thing to think about, like that we can, like we don't have to do it all. Like the weight isn't all on us, but that like with staying in our zone of genius, we can like best help the world. Yeah.
Yeah. And to your point, it's like one person helping one person helps another person, right? So we don't have to, blow up everything in order to make change. Like to your point, like let's stay in our zone of genius. Like let's do the thing that we are really good at. And I'm a Disney fan, and there's a song in Frozen 2. And I don't remember the exact, title of the song, but it basically talks about like, I'm going to do just the next right thing. Like, I'm just going to take this one step to do the next right thing. And that's both how I feel like my life has kind of been, but how I feel like, particularly like I'm 30, I'm a millennial. So like those of us in this age group, it's like, we don't have to plan the rest of our lives, but like, can we just plan the next right step? And what is the thing that I need to do next to get to a larger goal or plan or whatever the case may be?
Right. And like being open to like however that unfolds. Like it could be like anything, like just like allowing yourself to be surprised too. Like
1000%. Yeah.
Because you did that, and now we have your brain. And
exactly. Yeah. And now I get to talk about the brain all the time.
Yeah. So like in your expertise, like around the brain, do you find yourself more often like when you're working with kids, are you like directly talking to them about the brain, or are you more so like using that knowledge in like how you approach it, or maybe both?
It's definitely both. And that's a great question. So I do, it depends on kind of which program and what day of the week it is, really. But I both use what I know about the brain to inform our work. So one of the programs that I run and I'm very intimately involved with is a mentoring program. And it is specifically for young people who, for one reason or another, are at risk of dropping out of high school before they graduate. And so we like that program is very brain informed. So like I provide training to volunteers about the brain. Like some of the things that we do are because it is going to help their brain. But in addition to that, we teach them about their brain. Like there's almost no age of a young person who I either haven't taught about the brain. I mean, probably like under 5 is maybe the youngest, but that's just because I'm not really around kids under 5. But I think that at any age, we can be teaching kids about the brain, whether it's elementary school, middle school, high school. It looks different in terms of the words that you use. Like when I work with middle schoolers, I talk a lot about the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, which are 2 different parts of the brain. And, I can go in more depth about them. But like, for example, the way that I describe them when I'm talking to middle schoolers is Bruce Banner versus the Hulk. So it's very Marvel, but one part of your brain is Bruce Banner, one part is the Hulk. So I'm using it. We sometimes use our hands to show different parts of the brain, our downstairs brain and our upstairs brain. But I say that to say that like there's no kid that's too young to learn and understand what's happening in their brain, because I mean, obviously, like our brains are powerful and they control everything about our lives, but I don't think that we fully understand how incredibly powerful our brain is and how much it's working all the time. And there's just things happening in our brain that we just aren't aware of. And sometimes I'll watch interactions happen or things happen, and I'm like, they're having a really interesting brain reaction, but they don't know it, right? For all kinds of reasons. Or they're just not able to fully think about what they're doing because their brain is kind of like hijacked and taken over.
Yeah. And it's like once we like know, like it's like awareness is the first step of like knowing like what's actually happening. And then you kind of like, it takes a while to like sit in that awareness of like, okay, so this is why this reaction is happening. And then it takes a while to be like, oh, like what if I shift this way? And when you work with
all of that
kids versus adults, like do you teach like similar concepts to both, or is it different? Or
yeah, so it kind of depends on really like what the goal is of the conversation, but at the core of it, yes. At the core of it, I am teaching them about similar parts of the brain. I obviously go into more depth and it's a little bit more nuanced with adults, but like absolutely, like I'm still teaching them about similar parts of the brain, but I'm both like using different words. Like I always say like, here's amygdala. Say amygdala with me, kids. But like I'm talking about it in different ways. I'm using different descriptors to describe what their brain does. And again, potentially going into depth about like one thing or another. So when I'm talking to like teenagers, I'm saying your amygdala is what makes you spontaneous and what makes you act without thinking, and it is what makes adults frustrated, right? But when I'm talking to adults, I'm saying your amygdala is where your threat response lives, and that is where a lot of your unconscious activity happens. So same thing, but different parts that I'm kind of talking about. But for the most part, yeah, like I'm still teaching the same parts of the brain and the same concepts, but in a different way and going into more depth with adults. But I think it's really interesting to talk about because even kids have a lot more control over their brain than I think any of us would realize. And there are tools. And one of the things I love about like the spirituality, the wellness community is how much and really I'm not in that community as much, but like rely on breath work and meditation and mindfulness, because like that is the easiest, quickest, cheapest / free way to control your brain is to meditate and to be mindful. And if you are having any sort of threat response, if you are scared, if you are angry, like sitting down for 5 minutes and doing deep meditation, I mean, it completely changes your brain, right? Like 8 weeks of consistent meditation. So that's really only like 5 minutes, 5 days a week will change your brain. So, I mean, I think that there's so much overlap in the spirituality community because of the power of breath work. But I say that to say, like, I think any age group can learn about the brain, because the brain can change at any point. You know, it changes all the time. It's interesting. Memory is this interesting concept I've started doing more research on. And when we think about something in the past, it changes the memory. So anyway, I'm such a nerd about it. But yeah, I teach all kinds of people about the brain. So much so that like my dad, sometimes I'll be like, your amygdala is too big, or your so I just like will throw out brain things in regular conversation, and people just get used to it.
Yeah. I love that. That's so cool. And yeah, I feel like as adults too, like the biggest thing, at least like for my personal experience with my own brain, is like talking to that inner child and like relating to like those experiences too, and like how that's also connected. Like I follow some accounts on Instagram about like conscious parenting, or like the conscious kid account on Instagram, and like, which are so good. But like
that's a great account.
Yeah. And like any of the advice they have for like conscious parenting and stuff, like I always like follow those accounts to like use for myself to like actually like help my own brain too. And like, I feel like we bury that part of ourselves sometimes, like as an adult, of like our, like you said, like those memories, like as a child, and like distorting them almost, or like really like creating the space to like get to the root of it. So like, this is all so fascinating. I feel like I could like interview you on this podcast for like 5 hours, just endlessly asking questions. But so with the amygdala, like all I know about that is that it, like, I mean, like you said, it's like reactive, and it's like fear threat response. Is the amygdala like always on? Is it like more active at certain points than others? Is there like kind of, with all parts of our brain, is there kind of like a positive side to that area of our brain and a negative side? Or like, you want to dive more into like,
gosh, that's such a good question. I love all of those questions. So the amygdala, it is absolutely a part of our brain that has both a positive and a negative, and it is such a fascinating part of our brain. So it is in the limbic system. It's in the back part of our brain. It is very deep in our brain, and so from like this is me nerding out, from like a research perspective, it's hard for us to do a lot of research on the amygdala because it's so deep into our brains. But the way that I sometimes describe the amygdala, and this is like very me being like a Disney fantasy whatever person, is like when you think of a castle, and there is kind of a king in the castle, queen in the castle at the very top. That's your prefrontal cortex, and that's the part of the brain. But think about like there's sometimes a guard outside of the castle, keeping the castle safe. So think of your amygdala as that guard. And so it's always on, and it's always just kind of looking around, making sure that things are safe. There's also the fact that, and this doesn't really go with that analogy as much, but it also is responsible for a lot of unconscious activity. So things like kind of like keeping our body going, but that's kind of a separate piece of it that, kind of there's two different pieces of what the amygdala does. So it's kind of always keeping, looking around, keeping us on guard, making sure we're safe, which is good. Like we want our amygdalas to keep us safe. But what happens is our amygdala acts within milliseconds, very, very quickly, when our amygdala thinks that there is a threat coming at us, when there's fear, there's something happening. And that's a really great thing, because we want to be able to act quickly. If there is, a lion running at you, you want to act incredibly quickly so that you can be safe. But the problem is that our amygdala, because of a variety of things, basically the stories that we've made up and kind of the things that we believe, our amygdala doesn't necessarily kind of understand the nuanced difference between a perceived threat and a real threat. So for example, one of my professors was talking about, she was going outside and she was, doing some planting, and she's fine with snakes. Snakes do not scare her. But she saw a stick, but in her mind, she swore it was a snake. And she could feel her threat response engage. Like, you know, and how you'll know it is that you get hot, like your body's hot, you start sweating, your palms are sweaty, you know, and other things are happening, like your adrenaline's going up, your eyesight gets more keen, it's easier for you to see things, your hearing becomes more astute, you can hear things more clearly. But what was interesting is, like, one, she's not scared of snakes anyway, and two, it wasn't a snake, it was a stick. And so, you know, there's this idea of perceived versus real threat. So we may have a threat response even when the threat isn't real, even when it's something that it, you know, shouldn't engage such a response from us. So that's where sometimes it can be kind of a negative thing, is that our amygdala takes over the rest of our brain without even us, you know, being able to consciously be aware. But at the core that it is a really good thing, you know, because it's always keeping us safe. It's always working. It's always making sure that we're okay. It also kind of helps us categorize things. The amount of stimuli that we have coming in all the time is crazy, between the cell phones and the noise and then this and that. And so our amygdala helps us put things in categories to help us kind of process information more quickly. But yeah, it's always on, and it has so many great functions. But sometimes, you know, if we're responding to a perceived threat that's not a real threat, it can engage in a way that we're not really necessarily thrilled with, because the conscious part of our brain, the part of our brain that really helps us think and process information and make decisions that we're really happy with, it shuts down when our amygdala takes over. So that's why, like, you may get into an argument with somebody, and then the next day you're like, why did I say some of those things? Why did I do some of those things? It's because you were acting from your amygdala, you know?
Right. Yeah. It's like that, like, fight or flight response almost, right? Like,
that is exactly what it is. That's why, you know, it's funny when I do trainings, I'm like, have you ever heard of the amygdala? And some people are like, I don't know. And I'm like, have you heard of fight or flight? And they're like, yes. I'm like, you've heard of the amygdala. It's just never been called that, because your amygdala is where your fight or flight response lives.
Right. Yeah. And I love that you talk about, like, perceived threats versus, like, actual threats. Because, like, I've read so much about that too. Like you said, that, like, with our phones and, like, with, like in the current society, like, yeah, we're constantly stimulated, and we're constantly having to, like, make that assessment within ourselves. Like, is this a threat? Should I be reacting? Like, should I be in, like, even with, like, I really resonated with, you were like, oh, when you get in an argument with someone, then you're like, why did I say that? Like, I feel like I've been able to, it's good to have the language around that now, like, oh, acting out of my amygdala. Because, like, even with certain stories that I have of, like, growing up and, like, healing my inner child stories of, like, feeling left out, or, like, feeling wounded, or just, like, anytime I'm acting from a place of, like, a wound or, like, trauma, that isn't really a threat in, like, the present moment. Like, if, like, my friend, like, does something that, like, I can feel that within me. Like, if I, like, am reacting to something that I, like, don't need to react to, and it's almost like I can, like, observe and, like, feel that this isn't the place that I want to be in. Like, while I'm reacting, I'm like, no, like, I recognize
it's
this.
Super meta.
Like, yeah. And then, like, after that feeling passes, you observe it in, like, a much more detached sense, like you said, like a conscious sense. And then you're like, oh, okay, now I can actually, like, think clearly and, like, sort through these thoughts. And, like, it's almost like you can't think clearly when you're, like,
you can't.
Like,
no, so you actually can't.
Yeah. So how do you work with, I guess, both kids and adults? Because, like, I think you've said before that you, like, work with people who have been through, like, traumas or who have had, like, certain, like, bigger hurdles to get over, like, based on, like, where they grew up, or, like, their conditions or their race or anything. How do you work with people on, like, is that something that we can control? Is, like sifting through those wounds and, like, reacting from the conscious part of our brain rather than letting the amygdala take over?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, there's both an in the moment versus a long term. So it's in the moment, it really is meditation. Like, it really, really is, because that can basically, like, it can calm your amygdala down and essentially, like, allow it to be a little bit more quiet, and basically create space that allows your prefrontal cortex, which is your conscious mind, to engage, and that allows you to think clearly. So that's kind of in the immediate, which is hard, right? Because when you're angry or frustrated or have a threat response, it can be really hard to say, like, wait a minute, I have got to stop. I've got to back up. I need to calm down. That can be really hard, but that's what you need to do in that moment, is, like, literally calm your body down. But in the more long term, I mean, it's therapy, and EMDR therapy is a really great. It's trauma informed, and so what it's really, it's really great for inner childhood work. It's great for anybody who's experienced any sort of trauma. There is an argument to be made that poverty and living in poverty is a traumatic experience. Racism is a traumatic experience. There are a lot of people who are experiencing trauma who don't necessarily wouldn't know to articulate it that way. But EMDR is going to, and it's heavy, it's deep, it's real stuff, but it's going to basically, a therapist is going to walk you back to kind of a time where you were experiencing trauma, and then kind of shift it and work in a different way, so that you show up differently. So that's really the more long-term way of being able to control what's happening. But I think that meditation and self-talk, I think that really being aware of what's happening, being aware of self-talk can allow you to tap into what's happening in your brain and be more aware of your kind of brain connection and saying, what's going on right now? So that you can engage quicker and say, whoa, I'm getting really frustrated. I'm getting really angry. I'm getting really sad. I'm getting really, I can feel my body acting up. I need to go, kind of take a moment and then engage. Right. But it's in the short term, it's meditation, it's mindfulness, and really taking the time that you need to calm your body down, which is really hard to do when you're stressed out, when you're overwhelmed. And I mean, that's why things like self-care are actually really, really important.
Right. Yeah. And self-care gets thrown around so much. That's the trend these days. But I love that, that perspective of self-care, okay, yeah, we can all take bubble baths or whatever if we have access to that. But that at the end of the day, it's sitting with your shadow too, and sitting with your the hard stuff, and observing your thoughts. And it's almost as if with the negative self-talk, it's almost you don't realize how deep it goes until you start observing it. Until you're I want to change this. And then you're oh shit. I talk to myself in this way.
Oh yeah, that's how it was for me. It was whoa, this is really bad. And I had no idea.
Right.
And I think that what you said is really important, that we have definitely, we've made self-care a thing, that it is bubble baths and wine. And for some people that actually is what it is. But I define self-care as giving yourself whatever you need to be whole and as your best self. So for me, it absolutely is naps on a Saturday. That's what self-care looks like for me. But and it almost will never look like bubble baths to me, because I don't like baths. So I don't I'm let me get in the shower and do what I got to do and get out. But it also I am privileged in the sense that self-care is a massage, once a month or once every 6 weeks, because I hold tension in my body, right? And self-care for me is also, I go to the chiropractor 3 times a week because my spine is jacked up, so it is whatever you need to be whole. And that may be a face mask, but that also might be creating boundaries around the types of conversations you're going to have with your family, because you don't want to have the emotional reaction to that on Thanksgiving and Christmas,
Totally. Yeah. That's I am a huge fan of chiropractic work as well. And that's played a huge role in my healing journey. But yeah, I was thinking about that the other day, that I was thinking back to times in my life where I was had less resources, had less clarity, had less grounding, wasn't fully connected to myself. And during really, really difficult times in my life, I remember just being what do I do? Who else? I don't know. I feel the world is against me, and blah, blah, blah. And then I was thinking about how the other day, or I think it was last month, I had some a bunch of old traumas and wounds come up that I was trying to heal through these. And I was I know what I need to do. I have more tools now. I have more resources now. And I am in a place of privilege now where I was able to go to the grocery store and get the supplements I like. And I was able to go to the chiropractor, and I was able to call up my therapist and pay $150 for an hour with her. And I was having this conversation with my roommate the other day that we were there is such this emphasis on that self-care is all these expensive tools and therapy and bubble baths and wine and all this stuff. So at the end of the day, I love that the practices you teach are people finding that within themselves, and finding that conversation and that meditation to be their own healer, and to empower themselves, that they have it all within them, and understanding their brain inside of their body and our bodies, that we have this connection to.
Yeah.
I think it's so
Yeah,
important.
because I mean, meditation is, I mean, it can be free. Like I happen to have the paid version of the Shine app because I love the Shine app, but I don't have to have the paid version to, in order for that
Right.
to be, I don't have to have a crazy amount of time. I used to do a lot more work with moms, and I would say, y'all get a timer until you're sweet babies. When this timer goes off, you can ask me all the questions again, but for 5 minutes, mommy's going to sit right over here and we're going to have some meditation time, but
Heck
I mean,
yeah.
everybody can do it, and it doesn't have to be something that, I mean, even women who are living in poverty, women who are, experiencing trauma, like it's hard, right? To take that time. But, I appreciate tools like a meditation where regardless of your situation, you can work to find 3 to 5 minutes a day. You know what I mean? Even if it's, I'm going to sit in the bathroom right before I take a shower in quiet and do my 5-minute meditation,
Right. And it's the tool that we like always have with us. Like I remember
all the time.
Yeah, like I got in this crazy like accident on a motorbike in Indonesia, and like it was like super traumatic and like super horrific. Ooh. And I didn't have like, all of a sudden I remember being in the hospital in Indonesia, and I was like, I don't have anything with me. Like I don't have like any of my tools. Like I don't have my like CBD or like my like anything. Like all I have is my breath. Like that is all I have. And so like when they were like injecting the anesthesia and like doing all this shit, I was like, thank God I've like dove into meditation before this experience, because I feel like I'm like pulling all the tools I have like just in this moment of like that. And that was all I had on me, and like I just had my body, and like it was powerful.
And that was all you needed. Yeah. And it was like, it took that to be like, well, wait a minute. This other stuff is cool and I like it. I'm gonna probably keep doing it, but I don't have to have those things.
Exactly.
That's so great.
Yeah.
I love it.
So I know, and I'll for sure link this for people as well, but you've given a TED Talk on the brain on poverty, which is like so incredible, and I highly recommend everyone watching it.
Thanks.
For sure. But you want to tell us a little bit about, you had mentioned like, just like the differences of a brain on poverty, or like the traumas of racism, and how that affects like our body chemistry and our brain.
Yeah. So I talk about this a lot because I really, really think it's important. And I think that whether you work with people who live in poverty, have lived in poverty, work with people or interact with people who have experienced trauma, I think this is important. Because if nothing else, I think it can allow a deeper understanding. There are a lot of stories that society has made up about people in poverty that just aren't real. So essentially, there are a few ways in which, and there are about 3 or 4, and I'll kind of talk about them quickly for the sake of time. I talk about them a smidge more in the TEDx talk. But essentially, they, folks who live in poverty and basically really either during, significant developmental time, so like 0 to 5, or for just a long time. Like my dad lived in poverty for, about 18 years. So for him, he's had these impacts for that reason. They have larger amygdalas, and their amygdalas are more attuned to environmental threats. So that idea of perceived threats, their amygdala is more likely to engage a lot more with perceived threats, threats that aren't necessarily, at air quotes, real threat. At the core of it, our brain is a social organ. So we have to be in community. We have to be in belonging. We have to like be in groups where we are accepted. And so that's, that can be really hard for teenagers who live in poverty, because teenagers at their very best click up. And they, I remember when I was working at teen camp, it was like there'd be a different clique a week. They were mad at each other about this, different boyfriends every week. It's crazy. And so it's hard because, young people are kind of bouncing. They're really trying to figure out who they are, who they want to be, who they want their friends to be. And then, that rejection can feel, even in the best of circumstances, it can feel like physical pain. But you add, this amygdala with that's bigger, it can just create a lot of problems. The prefrontal cortex doesn't finish, that's the conscious brain, doesn't finish developing in the best of circumstances to your early 20s. Folks who have grown up in poverty or who've had trauma during 0 to 18, what we call adverse childhood experiences, their prefrontal cortex is not as thick and has less gray matter. Those are just sciencey terms to say that their prefrontal cortex is not as strong. So that like executive functioning, they're just not as good at it. Thinking into the future, planning, organizing, all of those things. The 2 other quick things I'll mention is that their hippocampus, which is where memory lives in our brain and where memory is kind of like sorted through. it is smaller because it's close to the amygdala. And so when the amygdala is bigger, it takes up more space. The hippocampus is smaller, so memory is impacted. And our levels of cortisol, so that's our stress hormone. If you don't watch out like me, it'll make your belly get fatter. I'm still kind of working that out from a few years ago, because it's just chronic stress. But our body, so when we get stressed, we have stressor. Our levels of cortisol increase until that stressor has basically gone away. That increase of cortisol in a short moment, like in acuity, is really actually good for our brains and body. But when it becomes consistent, so when you're just like living in a constant state of stress, i.e. poverty, or living in some sort of traumatic situation for a long time, so like being a child in foster care, for example, that's an area that I do a lot of work and research into. It can increase your levels of cortisol beyond what our bodies can handle, and it can make you sick. It can make you gain weight, but it can also, increase your risk for diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, depression, anxiety, all kinds of things. So it can have both the mental impacts of things like being more basically attuned to perceived threats, can make it really harder for you to do executive functioning tasks, but also can make you sick.
Yeah. Wow. And is there any way for like any of those effects, like the decreased gray matter, the increased cortisol, are there ways to like shift and change that once you like bring awareness to those?
Yeah, the really amazing thing about the brain is that it is malleable, it's plastic, it is literally designed to change. So in terms of the amygdala, it's that breath work, right? And really, focusing on that. But in terms of the prefrontal cortex, kind of a really great way to mitigate the impacts of that decreased gray matter is practice. So things like, if I'm, 18 or 19 or 20 and, I'm living in poverty, being like taught and modeled and practice things like planning, organizing, those tasks being very explicitly taught to someone and then being able to practice them. Because the reality is just because you lived in poverty has no impact on your ability to be successful. It might be harder, but there are just some skills that you just didn't necessarily have access to. So they just have to be taught to you, and then you have to practice them just like you would anything else. My dad, who was in extreme poverty for 18 years of his life, he's wildly successful, and he's really good at things like thinking into the future and planning and organizing. But at 18, he probably didn't have that ability, right? Or even 20, 21, when the amygdala is more fully developed. But I mean, the really great thing is that our brain is designed to change. And so, those of us who are in the nonprofit sector, we can really impact the brains of people. And one of the things that I shared in the TEDx talk, if anybody has a chance to watch it, it's only about 10 minutes, is that if you want to impact this world in that way, like, so if you want to impact people who live in poverty, you want to impact people who have experienced trauma, and you work at a Fortune 500 company, donate to a nonprofit, volunteer for a nonprofit, support the entities that are doing the work, but also just understand that people living in poverty don't make air quotes bad decisions because they are, the words that we use are things like lazy and, those types of words. It's because their brain is different. And because they're stressed out and worried and probably physically tired from both the brain stuff and, people that are living in poverty are more likely to work jobs that are physically demanding and taxing. So, one, having empathy for folks who have a different lived experience, but also, volunteering or donating to organizations who are trying to improve the lives of people who live in poverty, experience trauma, that sort of thing.
Right. Oh, that is so important. And I love that so much. Like that distinction between, and I was having a conversation the other day kind of about this too, it was along the lines of like centered around spiritual bypassing, essentially, of like that, like, yes, all these like tools are valid, like meditation and like mindset, but like a lot of times I feel like there's like this gap in like spirituality and like wellness communities and things like this, where it's like, oh, just like go out into nature, or like your thoughts create your life, or like you are capable of creating anything, and like all those things are like kind of true to a certain extent, but it's like kind of bypassing that idea of like the tools for the most part are the same in terms of like our mindset, but there's like different starting points in life and like different like resources that we have access to on like different levels of those like starting points. And I love that you say like having more empathy for those, because like society is so quick to like put people in boxes or like label humans of like, oh, they're just lazy or they're unmotivated, rather than getting to like the root cause of the like, why is this, and how can we like prevent stuff like this from happening in the future, and how can we like actually provide tools to like create like a level playing field for people. And it seems like you're doing exactly that. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I just want to like quickly say about what you said is like everything you said is spot on. And I have some beef is the wrong word. I don't know. I don't love the idea of manifestation. I understand to your point, like this idea that like mindset actually really does matter. Like I'm from the brain girl is going to tell you that mindset and self-talk and all that stuff matters. But the reality is, if I live in poverty, if I am Black or brown, if I am in the LGBTQ community, very specifically if I am trans, if I am a child in foster care, like there are groups of people for whom they can manifest all day long, but they are not going to be able to build, you know, the same sort of life because they are starting off 25 steps behind. And they, you know, right now they're just trying to get to, you know, to the starting point so that they can even move forward, you know. And if I am, you know, a 25-year-old who's dealing with the trauma of poverty and foster care, like manifestation probably ain't gonna work for me. So, you know, I believe in mindset. I believe in self-talk. Self-talk literally changed the game for me. And those things are so important. But, you know, those types of tools have to be accompanied by other things for a whole lot of groups of people.
Right. Exactly. That is so important to talk about. And yeah, I love I saw like it might've been a meme or like something the other day that was like, maybe you manifested it, maybe it's white privilege. And like, I feel like that's like across the board. Like, and I am so guilty of that. Like I totally used to speak in those terms, but like I honestly just went back and deleted like all my content where I talked about manifestation. Cause I was like, ugh,
well, when you know better, you do better.
Like, yeah.
Right. And when you know better, you do better.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it just has so much of that connotation to it of like, it's like, okay, like if you manifest a job, like what propped you up to be able to like more easily manifest that job? Or like, yeah, all of those things you said are like so important. So thank you for adding that in. Yeah. So I guess in terms of my notebook, hold on, but you talk a lot about like compassion fatigue and stuff like that as well. Do you want to dive a little bit more into what that means and like how that's connected to empathy?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. So, you know, I talk about it more specifically in the context of like therapists, people who work in the nonprofit sector, but in theory, it could impact a lot of people. So compassion fatigue is this kind of, it's this thought that you basically have, you know, you, in layman's terms, if you will, right? Like you care so much about separate groups of people and you do so much work to like care for them that like your sweet brain and body is tired. Right. And so, you know, I am like, I believe in empathy. Like it is a core value of mine. It is a core value of just like, of like my business. It matters so much to me that we are empathetic, and the way that that is defined by Teresa Wiseman, who's a nursing scholar, as well as, you know, Brene Brown uses her definition, is that essentially it is feeling with people. And the reality is like when you feel with people, it requires you to feel on your own and to dig up some of your own stuff. And that can make you fatigued. That can make you exhausted. Right. And so I go back to a lot of like the same tools that we've talked about. So, you know, if you're going to engage in empathy with somebody, whether it's your job, whether it's just you have a friend who has just dumped some stuff on you and needed you to be really empathetic, you need to give your body what it needs and your brain to deal with that like empathy and compassion fatigue and drain. And so it's things like rest and, you know, mindfulness and meditation, which I keep going back to, you know, and self-care and boundaries and being really intentional about how you're treating yourself, your brain, your body. Because when you are giving a lot to other people, you got to be pouring into yourself too. And so, you know, again, that can mean, you know, you're in a helping profession and you just are generally more susceptible to compassion fatigue if you're in a helping profession, or, you know, you can be an empath. Like I would imagine so much that empaths feel compassion fatigue, or you could just be a person who like, you know, maybe you're the one that all of your squad comes to dump their stuff on. You know, you may feel compassion fatigue, and it, you know, it can just make you feel very drained and burnt out. And so again, going back to all of those same tools, you've got to make sure that your cup is full if you're going to be giving stuff to other people. And I think, this idea of boundaries, and if the way that I describe it is like a phone battery. If I know that I am on E, if I'm on red, I am on 10%, and somebody's like, hey, I need to have a really hard conversation with you. I may say like, hey, can you give me 10 minutes? Can you give me a day? Can you give me, I need to get myself up at least to the green, on an iPhone battery before I can give to somebody else. Because if not, I will burn out. I will have compassion fatigue where I'm just done. And it may show up like I don't care anymore. I'm burnt out. I don't want to have this conversation anymore, even though that may not be who I authentically am.
Right. Yeah, that's amazing. And that's so good that you practice that as well, because I can imagine that you are the one that so many people lean on. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, but I've got some people that I, can call and people that pour into me. And again, I'm really good about like boundaries and rest and self-care. Like I sleep 8 hours. I love a nap. I do things like try to drink a lot of water, like all of those things. Yeah. And sometimes I'm like, I'm tired. I'm sorry. I can't have this conversation right now. Or, I got to turn my phone on Do Not Disturb because I need a minute,
Right. Yeah. That's so amazing. That's so like necessary. And I feel like that's so common in, like, I feel like a lot of people that I've spoken to that are in the nonprofit world or in professions like that, like you were talking about, like it's so common to like feel this like pressure, this need to like give everything you have to like everyone else. And like, that's such like a noble pursuit. And like, I understand the intentions behind it and it's so amazing, but like, yeah, that concept of like, we need to show up for ourselves too. And like, you can't give on like an empty battery, and you can't like show up in the way that you want to like actually make an impact if you don't have your energy.
Exactly.
Up. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. We talked a lot about like work-life balance too, like on that panel that we were on as well. And I think, that's like such an important concept that's like tied into all of this as well. Yeah. And I'll link that for people to listen to too. But,
awesome.
So in terms of like the prefrontal cortex, you said that's the conscious thinking brain, right?
Yep, that's where our executive functioning tasks live, and the conscious part of our brain, and it's right behind our forehead. Okay. So is it that certain like parts of our brain like activate like more than others, and they like take over, and we're in one section of our brain at a time? So that's such a good question. So on a, if we're just kind of like going about our day, everything's fine and calm and good, we're using very different parts of our brain and multiple parts of our brain at the same time, right? But, certain things will make more like certain parts of our brain activate and be engaged than others. So like, for example, when we hear stories, like different parts of our brain are activated when we hear stories. When the prefrontal cortex is split up into two different parts. And so when we are engaging in empathy, it's the right prefrontal cortex that's more engaged. And literally, if you like, if you have a brain equipment on, it's the coolest thing. And like you tell a story or you do something, you can like literally see the part of their brain light up as you're like watching it. It's so cool. I've nerded out on it so much. But different parts of our brain will engage during different times. So like we're using multiple parts all the time. But like if I hear a story, a certain part of my brain is going to engage. If there's this concept of mirror neurons. So if I see you yawning, I'm more likely to yawn because of this like concept of mirror neurons. And our brain, it's weird. It's like our brains are connecting to each other. It's like the craziest thing. Yeah. So there are times where different parts of our brain will light up or engage, like, and I say light up because it does that on like when you're like watching the brain for different things. So, like for example, the amygdala is always going, right? But if I tell a story, the amygdala is still working and operating because our full brain is, but this one part is going to be way more engaged, right? If that makes sense. So, all of the things are happening, but one little thing may like pop up and be a little bit more like, oh, what's happening? And then say, okay, I'm just kind of paying attention. Now, like a little dog, like your dog is, I needed an analogy. So like your dog is always just like sitting around being like, hey, I'm here. I'm cute. And then if I'm like, here's a, I don't have a dog, I have a cat. And my cat's very different. So cats are different. But if I'm like, here's a bone, my dog's like, oh, a bone, look. And then it's like, okay, I'm back down here, right? So different parts of our brain will engage. And, it's interesting because facts and numbers and data are important, but our brains like stories. And so our brains will engage more with stories when we have to do a lot of thinking. So like if I'm doing a hard task and my brain is having to think, my prefrontal cortex is busy because I'm thinking, right?
Yeah.
And that part of the brain requires more mental energy than like a rest state. So like, that's why if you're having like a super productive day, you may feel like, gosh, I need a little bit of a break, because like your prefrontal cortex just requires a lot of energy. But yeah, different parts of the brain kind of light up and engage depending on what we're doing.
Right. Yeah, that's so crazy to like, I feel like now I'm going to observe my thoughts in like such a different way, but is it possible?
Which is awesome.
Yeah. And is it possible to like, I know you said the hippocampus is like responsible for our memories. So, and you said that like a lot of times we like tell stories and like our memories kind of get like diluted. So like, is the process of like, I mean, is it possible to like rewrite those memories and like rewrite that script and like be like what tools are used? I know we already talked about like therapy for like doing stuff like that, but I guess what does your work look like in that area?
Yeah, so memory is a thing that in terms of the brain, I probably, I know a little bit about, but not a crazy amount about. And so there are probably like memory experts, if you will, who would be able to like have a more science-based answer to that question. But I know that, because every time we think about a memory, we tweak it just a little bit here and there. I mean, I would think that almost like by definition, we really could rewrite a memory. And what's interesting about memories in the general sense is that they are from our perspective, which when I say that, it's like, well, duh, of course, but like you kind of have to really think about it. So like if I'm, if I put a camera up to something and I observe an interaction, that like outside, very black and white perspective is different than my perspective and yours. So that's why it's like there's three sides of the story, my side, your side, and the truth. And that's because literally I am viewing an interaction from my perspective, and it is muddied by, my perception of you, my mood, my perception of what's happening. So, memories are not black and white. They are very nuanced and complicated. But I would imagine you could like almost make yourself rewrite a memory. But I would imagine that depending on that memory, it would require a lot of emotional bandwidth to have to do that. But I think what would probably be more productive, and this is me like thinking also like my psychology hat, is going back to the memory and processing the emotions attached to that memory so that the memory can exist how it was. And so that you can say like, yeah, that thing happened and it was painful then, but I can deal with it now. But what's interesting and frustrating about, where the hippocampus and the amygdala is because they're so deep in your brain, we don't have the same number of brain equipment to dig into it. So, I can, there's equipment that's really like inexpensive that I can acquire and use to run like experiments and tests. And so there's a lot of data because we can, it's easy to do, but to really like see what's happening and see what lights up your amygdala and your hippocampus, because they're deep and far down, it requires basically an MRI, which is expensive and you can't move around. So that's why I don't have as much, context on it, but I know enough to know that, you probably really could rewrite a memory if you thought about it and, shifted it enough. You probably could.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, like almost like rewriting, like the memory will still exist, but rewriting like our emotions around it and like rewriting our reaction.
Right. That's, I think, would be the goal. Exactly. That would be the goal, is that like there's this memory, but it doesn't have to be as painful to think about. Because what's interesting about memory is that, this is another thing with the amygdala. Our amygdala attaches emotion to really intense and important memories. And it's what helps stick some memories. So like, most of us that are at least like my age can remember where we were when we found out about 9/11, right? Our amygdala attached an emotion to that, right? If you have gone through some really intense trauma, you can be triggered and you can have, a lot of those memories and feelings. If there's a smell that maybe you smelled a lot when you were growing up and you had fond memories of, right? So like, all of our senses are attached to that, in the sense that like we can see, we can hear, we can smell something that can trigger a memory and then can trigger the emotions attached to that. So if I am re-triggered and re-traumatized and I accidentally, I'm walking down the street and I saw somebody who I had a traumatic experience with, I'm then going to have all of the same emotions attached to that because of the amygdala and the hippocampus and that relationship, right? So the goal would be to deal with the emotions attached to that memory so that I don't have the same emotional reaction moving forward.
Right. Yeah, that's so powerful.
Which is hard, to be fair, super hard.
Oh my God.
But that would be the goal. Right.
Right. Yeah. And like almost that like distance and time element where sometimes it just takes like time to like work through that. And, yeah. And like paying attention to the emotions too. Cause I feel like a lot of times with like manifestation too, it can be like, there's a lot of script out there that it's like, just don't even think about that. Like only positive thoughts. They're like the worst phrase ever to me is good vibes only. I'm like, no, you need to like process your shit. Like you need to like, yeah. Like
exactly. You can't, that's not real. Like emotions are data. And so when you have a negative emotion, your brain and body is communicating something. And so the best way is to dig in and be like, why do I feel this way? Like, what is happening here? Why am I in anger? Is more often than not a secondary emotion. There's something under anger. So dig into it. Why are you so angry? Why are you feeling this way? Because that's how you get to the heart of things and fix things and move forward, which is really about also like emotional intelligence. But good vibes only is also just like not real. So like, let's just like not pretend like you won't ever have emotions that you don't want to experience, because it is data and it will tell you something.
Exactly. Oh my God. I wish like me 3 years ago needs to listen to this podcast, because like I would get so frustrated all the time that and I had this mantra that I was using. Please, no one else use this mantra, but it was like no bad days, and I was like I'm having a bad day, like I'm having all these emotions, and I'm like not supposed to, and I was like, okay, like 3 years later now, I'm like, well, duh, like yeah, you had a bunch of shit you weren't dealing with, and like a bunch of stuff coming up that like it's gonna come up over and over and over again until you actually be present with it and like observe it. So like,
and then there's all that guilt associated with, because if you made up a story in your head that you can't have a bad day, and you have a bad day because of whatever reason, because maybe you slept wrong and your neck's hurting. I mean, just it can be anything, right? Like, and you have a bad day, and then all of a sudden you feel guilt because you decided you don't have any bad days, and then there's it's like, just have the day and just try to maybe restart the day, but like, to just ignore the emotions, it's not healthy, it's not productive, and all that it does is it's going to come up later, and it's probably going to be more intense later, because that emotion has just been sitting and getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Exactly. I feel like I really like that lesson got like solidified into like my journey when I was on after like the injury. I had like so much time for introspection because I was just on like bed rest. And like during that time, like I remember like actively being like, that's when I learned that lesson, that I was like, if things are shitty, acknowledge that they're shitty. Like just be like, yes, this sucks because of this, because of this, because of this, because of this. But also I can be present with this pain and like hold this pain really gently while still having perspective of like the bigger picture, and like this is temporary, like I can go through this. And I feel like that like balance between the two is like really what helps like kickstart my healing journey personally. But
yes, all of that.
So important. So I also wanted to talk to you about, I know, kind of pivoting a little bit, but I know you do diversity and inclusion trainings, and I was looking at kind of like how you structure those on your website. And like, first of all, are you getting like significantly more people coming to you during this time about those now?
My phone's blowing up. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
I bet.
Yeah.
I bet.
Yeah, which is great. So yeah.
Yeah.
So I have like an existing how I structure trainings, and then I'm creating some new packages that, depending on when this podcast drops, that may already be live. We'll see. But right now my work is really primarily with organizations, and I provide both training sessions that, in terms of the D&I space, it's the training I do the very most is about unconscious bias. But then I also can provide consulting work and audit. So basically looking at your organization from website to policy and saying, this is not inclusive and here are the reasons why. And to just kind of dig into your organizational culture and walk alongside organizations so that they can really build equity and inclusion into their culture, so that they don't have to have a consultant forever and ever, right? Like you just kind of shift how you do business. And so I'm doing that work with organizations. But I have, really found and been thinking a lot about the fact that in order to make real change on a macro level in society, and I'm just going to be super like real on this podcast, but like I think white women have to do the work. like white women specifically, because of all of what we know in the world, have to do equity and justice and inclusion work. And that may be attached to an organization, it may not be. But I am working on a few package options that will include some group work to really dig into justice and equity as an education piece. So understanding, like, why are we in this place where the world is so unjust and so inequitable, and how, as can I as an individual actively, consciously work to be an anti-racist? Like, how can I make sure that my actions, my thoughts, how I show up in the world are promoting justice all of the time, as opposed to creating continuing to create a world where groups of people are oppressed, where systems are set up for them to not be successful, and where systems are broken and they are not successful, right? Because some systems were literally built to oppress people, and some systems weren't. They just were built by a homogenous group of people, and now that group is very diverse. And so I'm working on some packages for women, because organizations are really, really important. But this work has to go beyond that, and has to include some personal work and a personal journey. And the wellness community, I had a life coach a few years ago. The wellness community, I think, has historically not done this well. I think that's not a secret to anybody 100%. In the community.
Yeah.
And so, that is part of the ongoing and kind of new work that I'll be doing, is working, with women who are, and specifically women who are leading the wellness community, in addition to women who are in the community who are, who have coaches, who, are following, the big, wellness people, the wellness influencers. So kind of doing both of those things, because I feel like that is how we can make really sustainable changes, by women doing the internal work of understanding why it is so critical that they show up constantly, as an anti-racist, and why they walk alongside, amplify, support Black women, support women of color, support trans women, support trans Black women and women of color, and really work to create a world where, this isn't the work I have to do anymore. Right. Where I'm doing different sort of work, but where, systems are different, and there are not inequities just built into our country, which is going to take a long time. We're dealing with, hundreds of years of baggage. It's going to take a minute to fix. But I'm adding some layers of that work to the business. So stay tuned.
Yeah. Oh, that is amazing. And thank you. Thank you for doing this work. And it's like, it's almost like unfortunate that this work is necessary, but like, it's the period that we're in. I mean, it has been the period that we've been in for like hundreds of years, but like, if more people are like coming to this right now, then like that, hopefully we're making some like massive scale changes. And that work is so important to do and to share. And thank you for calling out white women too, because like, as a white woman, we 111,000% need to be like showing up better. And especially because women have more empathy, at least I've read, like in terms of like the brain, that like we are sometimes more connected to that I think it's like more important than ever to like examine and unpack our unconscious biases, and doing it by investing in Black women who know this best, and like investing in like trans women and people of color, and just all across the board. And I know I am for sure going to hire you for my businesses, because I think that's incredibly important moving forward for the Happy Humans Project, for my media agency. And with my media agency, I work with a bunch of different brands that are in the like lifestyle and wellness space. And I've been having a lot of conversations with them over the past couple weeks, and kind of understanding that like they don't know what to do, right? And a lot of these are like dominantly white-owned organizations. So I'm for sure going to refer you to all of them as well to like get that, like, because I feel like that's what we need, is like this really like thorough like unpacking of like how each organization was built in the first place, because it needs to be completely restructured. Like it's not just like a quick
fix.
Yeah.
No, because here's the thing, like, and again, some systems are problematic. The criminal justice system was literally built to continue slavery, period. It was. I don't care what you tell me. I've done enough research. I know that that's the case. But there are other systems and organizations that were created by a homogenous group. They were created by white men. And they were created
Mm-hmm.
by white men for white men, and they weren't thinking about women, and they for sure as shit weren't thinking about people of color and Black people and trans people and queer people. These things weren't. Whether it was probably often intentional, and sometimes it wasn't, but they were not. And so we have to dig in. We've got to unpack some stuff. We've got to dismantle systems. We've got to rebuild them. Ben and Jerry's is a brand that I've been following for a while, and I'm a vegan, and they have non-dairy ice cream, which is awesome. So I can continue to support them.
Yes.
But they've been putting stuff out for a minute about like all of this stuff and how to, learn and get into it and dig into it. So I think, I'm a huge fan of Hamilton, the play, and there's like all of these quotes that I love, like, history is happening, and history is going to look back on us during this time, and I want to be able to be proud, if in 20 years when I have grandkids, of like, look at what we were able to do. And I probably won't have grandkids because I probably won't have actual children, but I mean, we need to take this moment and turn it into a movement, because if we take this moment and leave it as a moment, like we will never fix this.
Right. And I feel like it was almost this like cosmic, like, I don't know, something where like we have this quarantine where like nothing's open and we can't turn to our normal distractions. So we're like all closed in this time. And it's like, and I hope to God that this is like a gigantic movement as well, because now that all this, like, especially for white people, and like we could talk about how the fact that like white people weren't awake to this, and now suddenly everyone's like waking up to this and it's like, oh shit.
But right. Like, we can talk about that, or we can just not, because it's like, let's focus on moving forward.
Exactly. Exactly. And like we can't look away right now. Like it's like so present here that like if we choose to like look away from this and like we can't pretend like this is not happening now that like everything is like out in the open. Like this is the time to like take this, and it's like uncomfortable as fuck to like realize something that like you didn't even know was going on, and then feel those feelings of guilt. So like turning that into action and turning that into hope, and like, okay, what future are we creating now that we know, and like now that we can like turn to women like you and like so many other Black women, trans women, people of color doing the work to like provide these resources and like the ability for like white people to invest in that and to like learn that like, yes, I hope this is leading to like so much like deep systemic change, and I hope we're just beginning like with all of this. Cause
I hope so too. Because some shit's gotta change. So
yeah, it really does. And thank you so much just for the work that you do is so incredible. And I am going to provide like all the resources for people to watch your TED Talk and your website. Jessica has a bunch of info on all of her services and a bunch of like, she has so many resources as well.
I've got some equity resources, and I'm even adding to that as I am aware of things, because lots of people are like, I want to learn, I want to dig into stuff. So, that's a really great place. Please do not call your Black friends and ask them how they feel about right now. It is trauma, and do not re-traumatize these people. Like, there are resources you can listen to. Austin Channing Brown has an amazing book you can listen to or read. There's so many things that you can do the work on your own. You can call me and pay me to do it, but don't call your random friends and ask them to be traumatized. It's not a good choice. But I mean, my web, you'll link to my website. There's a way to reach out to me. Potentially by the time this is up, I'll have kind of some more information on packages. If not, I'll have, you can sign up for my email list, and I will, I'll make sure to kind of send some info out about that. Cause that's kind of in the works around the work I will be doing with women. But yeah, there's lots of places and ways to find me.
Amazing. I will definitely link all of those. I'll link your Instagram, like all of the ways to reach this amazing woman. But thank you so much for your energy and just your time and your wisdom and your like insane amount of knowledge and just empathy with everything, because I think all these messages are so important for me to hear. I just learned so much, and for everyone, hopefully everyone in the audience to hear as well. So I want to leave you with one final question that I ask all my guests of what makes you a happy human, and what is your best advice for anyone wanting to be a happy human?
What makes me a happy human? What makes me a happy human is, gosh, it would probably change depending on the day, but today it is being able to live out my passion of helping other people in a variety of ways and contexts, but it's being able to live out my passion. And I think my advice for other people who want to be happy humans is figure out what drains you and figure out what gives you energy. And you cannot always get rid of the things that drain you, but try to infuse some, the things that give you energy and that you love. Try to make sure that you're getting them as much as you can. And it's not always simple, and there's a lot of privilege associated with that statement, and I know that. But try to do the things that you love and that give you energy, whatever those things are.
Amazing. That is incredible advice, and you are so amazing, and you're leaving like such a positive impact with your life. So
thank you. I appreciate that.
And just who you're embodying. Like, you're so inspiring and so incredible and so beautiful. And I'm so grateful we got to have this talk today.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much. This has been great.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening. As always, if you enjoyed this episode and it inspired you in any way, we would love to hear about it. If you have the space to leave us a review on iTunes, that is always much appreciated. And or if you want to take a screenshot of you listening on your device and post it to your Instagram story sharing your biggest takeaway, and make sure to tag us at Happy Humans Project so we can connect more with you there.